Should I get started? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Angeline Dukes. I'm a PhD candidate in Christy Fowler's lab in the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior. I'm also someone who's very passionate about teaching. And so I'm very excited to welcome everyone here today to today's seminar for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity Speaker Series for Teaching Professional Development. This is a new series that was developed by Andrea Nicholas and Dr. Audrey Chen Liu from the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior, with support from the BioSci Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And this seminar is open to all faculty, staff, and students. The series will feature talks by expert speakers, followed by a 45-minute casual discussion session between speakers and students. And at the end of the series, students who attend 6 out of 8 of the talks and complete the related assessment will receive a certificate of completion and letter detailing their involvement and dedication to promoting excellence and inclusivity in STEM education. After the lecture and discussion, there is food and refreshments. Please remember to sign in using the QR code. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Audrey Chen Liu, who will then introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Yes, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Williamson to UCI. She's joining us by Zoom, and she actually did her PhD over in Science Education and Inquiry Methodology from Indiana University. And she did a postdoctoral fellowship after that at Butler University. So her research actually looks at STEM education for social, ecological good, primarily emphasizing curricular and programmatic efforts for future STEM and medical professionals. And she's also really trained in discursive methodology. So she takes a methodological approach using ethnography. And I'm really excited about her work. She actually has some really amazing work that's just coming out now, which uses discourse analysis to look at how we talk about diversity. And just getting to know her personally as we were biotech scholars together, she's really been really great at giving me advice on my own research. So I'm just really delighted that she's here at UCI. And I will turn it over to her. And let me go ahead and turn the camera over so she can see you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be able to talk with everyone today about the work that I've been doing. Thank you again for the invitation to participate in this really important series. There's no time better than now to be amplifying DEI and J work within the sciences. So I'm going to begin with providing some context for the work that I do, partly because I believe that our stories make evident the values and the guiding principles that oftentimes shape our work. Over the years, I've heard time and time again that all good science starts with some sort of curiosity, often something that can't be satisfied for a very long time. And it's oftentimes filled with more failures than successes. And that's true to my story too. I began my journey in Washington State, which is where my family is from, by way of the military and the South. I originally went to Washington State University to study chemistry. And during my first semester, I was diagnosed with a rare illness and had to drop out. And that was at the end of my first semester. After I recovered, I eventually went to vocational school to be a medical assistant. And I worked with a group of neurologists for several years. I knew eventually that I wanted to study science, and I took this route first in hopes that things with my health would settle. Then several years later, maybe 6 or 7 years later, I returned to Washington State University, and then I decided to study biology this time. I think you could probably say that my own health issues inspired a new direction, but also was working with a group of neurologists. But after having worked with them, I knew I didn't want to be a doctor. I did not like the prospect of being the person that people would call when they were about to die. So I came back to the university as a single parent, and I was determined to do something that was beneficial for me and my son. Here are some of the pictures that I think are representative of my time, my undergraduate years. So on the left, you'll see me, and my son is in the back holding a sign. I was talking with a journalist just after leading a protest called Take Back the Night. It's a protest against violence against women. I was involved in lots of student activism, with Black student organizations, with women's organizations, lots of different groups on campus. In the middle, there is a picture from when I was working in the lab. At the time, I was working on, for undergraduate research, I was working on 2 different projects. One was about ABO polymorphism in Alaska Native American communities, and the other was mRNA extraction using ancient fecal matter. Just being curious, I asked my mentor why he wanted to study what he was doing. And he told me that his primary goal was to debunk what he called Native American origin stories and to find a new one that was rooted in science. A few weeks later, I quit the lab because I didn't want to knowingly participate in anti-Indigenous projects. So on the right is a picture of me with my now husband at a sorority event. Through my sorority, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, I led and participated in a lot of different STEM outreach events, oftentimes in communities where there weren't a lot of Black scientists or Black women scientists involved. And this was really important to me because as a college student, I saw so few Black and Indigenous students in my college and science and math classes, but I wasn't convinced that it was an issue of interest. I knew plenty of people who loved science and math, but I thought that they may have encountered something like I did when I was working in the undergraduate research group, finding out that some of the proper science, what we know as proper science, is used to marginalize Black and Indigenous peoples, their histories and their cultures. So this led me to sort of my first puzzle, as I call it, on the bottom of the screen, thinking about how are STEM and society intertwined. And I still don't have a perfect answer for this, but this is what got me to thinking about graduate school. So when I was first exploring options for graduate school, I had to decide, should I pursue a PhD in genetics? Because that's what I was studying and was investing my energy in, or should I find a new area? And I went to the office and had a talk with one of my genetics professors. This particular professor was really interested in the intersections of STEM and society, spent a lot of time in our classes talking about the eugenics movement, ethics around sort of the innovations in genetics. And we had a long talk and she said, you don't need to do 7 years of bench work to help people understand the connections between STEM and society. So I ended up doing a lot of research and finding out about different science education programs. And I saw that a lot of them were focused on equity, but most often in K-12 learning environments, which I didn't really have an interest in K-12 science education in the classroom. I was more interested in community engagement, outreach, and undergraduate education. So I realized early on into looking into graduate school, I still wanted to do some advanced training in biological sciences, but I also needed some social science research skills and some education skills. So I ended up eventually, it was a really roundabout way of going about it, but I essentially created an individualized doctoral program where I combined science education with social science research methods, and I had a concentration in biological and environmental sciences. So for me, that meant I took some courses on pedagogy, how to teach, how learning works. I took a lot of classes in biological and environmental sciences and did some internships within the biology department. And then I also did quite a bit of training around social science research methods, including the history and philosophy of science. And through this work, I became really interested in how scientists are socialized. How do they become members of their field? What were the norms and values they came to adopt? And how did these play out in the lab and in the classroom? So here again, I have pictured some things that represent what I did during graduate studies. On the left, you'll see me, I'm holding a fairly young baby at a STEM outreach event. This is my youngest child. Here, I started a couple of different organizations on campus. One was for graduate women in STEM. And this was just a gathering space for women, all races, all backgrounds, to have a space for solidarity and support. Oftentimes, these folks were the only woman in their fields, and they would be interested in teaching, mentoring, science outreach, but didn't know how to go about doing that. And so in that group, we essentially drew on the evidence-based practices within the field of science education and use those to apply it to college classroom learning environments such as labs, recitations, but also community outreach events, which is what I have pictured here. And then on the far right is another organization I was involved with getting started. This one is called I Can Persist STEM Initiative for Girls and Women of Color in STEM. And I worked primarily with graduate students again. These are all graduate women of color, lots of different disciplines, biology, chemistry, neuroscience, computer science, again, to provide a supportive space for learning things that folks were interested in particular, thinking about the intersection between STEM and society, where we would make, for example, environmental justice would be the problematic. And each person who was involved in the initiative would think about, okay, I'm a neuroscientist, how would I think about solving this problem? I'm a biologist, how would I think about solving this problem? And they would come together and have dialogue around how do you think about STEM and social justice in tandem beyond just representation. And in the middle is CERTL, the Center for Research, the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning. It's a national network with institutions who are all developing, looking to develop graduate students teaching and professional development skills. So mentoring, teaching, lots of different professional skills that folks need. So for my dissertation work, I was really focusing on how do we prepare the next generation of scientists to advance equity and justice within and through their fields. And by that, I mean, it's both within the disciplinary context. So how within your discipline are you looking at thinking about issues that have implications for equity and justice, but also how are you making environments more welcoming for people whose cultures, values, ideas aren't necessarily aligned with whiteness, higher upper class norms, things that sort of prevent Black, Indigenous, people of color from participating in STEM fields. And so then after graduate studies, I was still on this mission to find ways to think about STEM and social justice together, and landed a postdoc working with a group who was using sustainability as a lens for curriculum across some undergraduate contexts. And this was more broad than STEM fields, but we were also looking to develop scientific literacy in fields that wouldn't necessarily be involved with any science learning. So we had courses like religious studies, we had business, getting people to develop their sustainability literacy and also their environmental literacy at the same time. Within this group, I stopped thinking as much about how are STEM and society connected and started thinking more so about how do you help other people see these connections and see how this might resonate with who they are. One of the things that I had read about the study by Ebony McGee, a researcher, I think at Vanderbilt, something called the equity ethic. This is a principled commitment to social justice that oftentimes a lot of Black and Latinx students see as a source of tension within science. So one of the ways to draw people in is to make those connections between STEM and the things that people care about more explicit. And with this project, we were doing that with sustainability in particular, and unpacking some of the histories of land and farming and the implications of that and how scientists think about sustainability alongside some of these more social issues. Oh, and so currently I'm an assistant professor within a school of medicine, within a pediatrics department. Technically, I'm called an assistant professor of pediatrics. And this is sort of a full circle moment for me because I'd previously worked with a group of neurologists and didn't foresee myself going back into anything that had to do with healthcare. And now I'm in this new role where I'm teaching medical residents and fellows how to teach. I'm not sure if a lot of folks in the room know this, but medical residents, after they finish their 4 years of medical school, they go into what we call graduate medical education, and now they're required to teach medical students. But similar to graduate students, they often don't have structured opportunities for developing their teaching practice. And so I drew on some of the experiences from working with graduate students who similarly had lots of time constraints, not a lot of structured opportunities to develop teaching skills, and then incorporated that into this resident as teacher training. So here again, not just taking teaching as just teaching, not just instruction, not just educating, but thinking about how is this work advancing something that matters for social good. So here it's health equity. How do we teach in ways that support physicians, the next generation of physicians, to be prepared to work with patients in ways that are honoring their dignity, humanity, and worth? I'm going to come back to this in a bit, but I want to make the connections between these anchors clear. So for me, I see each of these sort of buckets of problems as different ways that STEM, social equity, and justice are connected. For my undergraduate and graduate studies, I primarily focused on equity within STEM, equity through STEM, and then transition to sustainability, and now health equity. And I see all of these connected through the research that I do in terms of thinking about discourse. How does language and social interaction, how does this play a role in all of these different activities? Because in my idea, social equity and justice, those competencies, those ideas are going to be the same across these different areas. They might manifest in different ways, they might be relevant in different ways, but everyone who's becoming a scientist or becoming a physician has to have a good understanding of what social equity and justice is in order to be able to advance it. I'm going to give you an example just from the work that I've done on equity in STEM, working with graduate students. But first, I wanted to give a little bit of context about language, because when I tell people I study language and social interaction, they're like, well, why does that matter? It's not that important. But one of my really close mentors, oftentimes when she talks about the ways that we study language, she reminds people of this a little childhood saying, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me." And the way that I'm approaching language is actually the opposite. So I have a few of my favorite quotes here on the screen. One is, "A broken bone can heal, but the wound of words opens can fester forever." And I'm sure we can all think of a moment where someone said something really cruel, or someone slighted us. Maybe it was minor at the time, but you were still thinking about it hours later. And then maybe you had another conversation about it later. All that to say, we think that words don't do as much harm as they do, but they can. And there's lots of research to support that words do impact us and can impact us for a while. The second quote, "But if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought." A lot of times, one of the reasons why I like this quote is because a lot of times people think that they have to change what they think, what's in their mind, to do something different or became in a different way. But in the research that I do with the perspectives that I take up, the way that you use language also informs how you think. So if you say that racist thing, it's going to make you think racist things. If you say the affirming thing, this is why people say you should write affirmations all the time. Those things, those take root in who we are. And we're always hearing that the things that we say matter because we also hear them. And the third quote, "All I need is a sheet of paper and something to write with. Then I can turn the world upside down." And this is really getting at the idea that language, how we use language, shapes how we make sense of the world. And it's also something that we can change. We can change how we write. We can change how we speak to imagine the world anew. So from a more theoretical perspective, I think about language as a medium for action, meaning that we do things with the words that we use. So we use words to do invitations. We use words to affirm people. We use words to signal to people that they belong in a space. We use words to signal that they don't belong in a space. Language is also constructed. And by that, I mean, we use words, we use pitch, we use bodily movements to perform language. And then third, and I think most importantly, is language use. How we use language produces a particular version of the world. that could be otherwise. And you can see examples of this pretty immediately within the context of the news. Thinking about the new variant of COVID that just came out, you can turn on some news cycles where people are talking about why people who've taken the vaccine aren't safe because of this new variant. You can also see people talking about how we need more people to take the vaccine because of this variant. There are these competing versions of what it means to participate in vaccination and the implications on how it impacts people. All that to say that we have versions that we produce, but we could make them otherwise and have different consequences. So in a metaphor, I want to use a metaphor that's closer to the biological sciences to talk about how I do research with language and language use. This is a very popular metaphor called the bee dance. So if you were a naturalist, for example, you would go out and observe as many bee dances as you possibly could. You'd want to know what's happening before the bee dance, what's happening during, and what's happening after. Similarly, with language use, what I do is record as many different instances or observe as many instances as I can of how people use language and try to identify patterns for what happens before, during, and after people are using language in a particular way. And then before we had technology, people couldn't record these things, but the recordings are critical for me to be able to rewind the recording and make as many observations as I can about how people use language. And then I develop a fine detailed account of each step of how people use language. And I'm going to give a few examples in a few minutes, but I want to give you a little insight into the process. And then once I have some sort of details about what might be happening, then I go read up on research that other people have done about different ways for using language. And those would inform how I interpret what it is that I see, but also can help me make sense of what's something new that I've captured that perhaps other researchers haven't captured. And then one of the things that the approach that I take that's distinct from research that goes out and interviews people, like if you're studying a bee dance, you wouldn't go interview the bees. You wouldn't ask them why they're doing what they're doing. You would just observe. Similarly, I don't interview people. I don't ask them why they're doing what they're doing. I just look at what they're doing. And here is, I think, a good way to think about, when we're talking a lot about equity and diversity and inclusion, we want to think about the difference between intention versus impact and what we can actually say anything about. We could guess what people's intentions are. We could guess why they did what they did, but we can know what the impact is. So if I have any hill to die on, I think it would be that we should study what people actually do so that we can examine what they're doing and also show what they're doing, because that's something that we can actually see. So now for the context of graduate teaching and professional development. As I mentioned earlier, I'd gotten really involved with thinking about socialization into STEM fields. And one of the things that I kept hearing was working with faculty to develop their teaching practice was really challenging because they were already set in their ways. They were oftentimes too busy and sometimes were unwilling to change their practice because they learned it the way that they did during graduate school. But another thing is that there weren't a lot of incentives for faculty to change their practice. Why would they change? They don't get course releases, they don't get rewarded for teaching within their field. So the saying goes that instead of focusing on people who are already there, focus on people who are in that transition space, who are just learning the norms, the values of their field. Granted, they're still learning the things that are valued through the faculty who they work with, through the peers who they work with. But what a lot of researchers have said is that we can make change in the middle. We can work with graduate students who are still developing their practice. So we know that there's a huge need to improve the quality of college level STEM education. to advance equity and also achieve national goals. But we also know that there's been limited uptake of evidence-based teaching practices within STEM fields in particular. We'll see there will be lots of studies talking about the importance of active learning strategies. And that's great. We know that those work. It's a whole nother beast to try to get people to actually implement those. So the question again is, how do you prepare the next generation of faculty to shift the culture? And one answer to that is to have this graduate student teaching and professional development. So people in the literature, a lot of people say this works. Developing graduate students works. They'll have surveys and questionnaires that show that there are changes in beliefs, and all of that is great. And I say that we need to actually study what people do, because we don't know how it works. We know that people say that it works, but we also know that the things that people say and what they do are two different things. So what I did was decided to start collecting recordings of graduate student teaching development meetings, with the idea that if this is where the work is occurring, we should study where it's happening. I recruited some groups from actually 4 different institutions. One isn't represented here on the slide, but I wanted to look at groups in different disciplines with different goals and different purposes that are all related to STEM graduate student teaching development. So the first group is for health professions educators. And these are people who will teach medical students, nursing students, dental students. These are graduate students who are in a program that their training is both science and education, not science education as the way that I've been trained. The way that this group does teaching development is through journal clubs. So they meet, they'll have a dedicated reading for their meeting. They'll meet and they'll discuss it. They debate the article, they talk about the merits of the evidence-based teaching practice, and then try to decide what sort of thing they'll take away from that reading. And this group had faculty and graduate students from Midwest and Southern institutions. The second group was a learning community, which is another model for teaching development with graduate students. This one was associated with the CERTL network. So they have some online webinar offerings paired with some local institutional meetings. These are graduate students and postdocs who are all interested in teaching from a lot of different fields, primarily in the natural sciences, but also some folks who were in social sciences. And then the third group is the group for women in STEM. This is one that I led. This was all women who were interested in teaching, mentoring, and outreach. And this is another model more so for affinity groups. There are a lot of different affinity groups within STEM fields based on identity, and this is that one. So what I did is I just collected the recordings, actually had them collect their own recordings of their meetings, and so I can analyze the data, and a little bit about analysis too. So because I'm looking at language and fine-grained detail, a huge part of the analysis is transcribing the data. For every 1 hour of data, it takes about 7 to 10 hours to transcribe. So this 28 hours of data is a career's worth of data for me. So I'm still collecting data with now residents who their teaching context is a little bit different, because I want to see if there are similarities and differences across these groups. So I'm going to show you just a few different cases of things that take place in these kinds of groups that I think are perhaps overlooked, or maybe folks don't realize if they're not paying attention to what's actually happening. So the first case comes from the health professions education group. And like I said, in each of the meetings, they have an assigned reading, and they all talk about the merits of whatever evidence-based practice is proposed. One of the things I ended up focusing on for this study was disagreements, because I found that across each of the groups, disagreement happened all the time. And I know that we know that some people are resistant to changing practice, but I was surprised by how much people disagreed. And it usually wasn't a direct disagreement. Only one time in my entire data set did someone say, I disagree. But they disagreed with questions and sometimes asking for advice. They would push back on those sort of things. In this case, there is a disagreement around what it means to provide accommodations. The article that they had read that week was about supporting disabled students in what is called anatomy labs, gross anatomy labs. And so, and you'll see on the transcript here, in the first few lines, there's someone talking about how they would support someone with disabilities in their class. And this person said essentially that they would wait until the person let them know that they had a disability, and then they would make some significant changes to ensure that that person would be able to access those materials. And then later on line 13, someone named Leo disagreed with this idea and offered instead that we should use universal design principles by setting up the classroom so that anyone could learn. And with these two sort of stances that were worked up in this interaction, the first one is what I would call normative centered approach to equity in the classroom, where the instructor waits until someone lets them know, and that everything is set up for neurotypicality. And the second version is where Leo disagrees, and their approach that's being offered is preempting inequities. So by setting up the class in advance, the student would never have to report to them if they have a disability. And that's the version of equity that Leo is offering. And what I found across my data is that there are all these competing versions of what equity is and how to implement it that get worked up in these disagreements. And what facilitators have an opportunity to do is come in and offer some rationale or assess some pros and cons of different ways that people think about equity. One thing to note too is that oftentimes when people disagreed in these meetings, the facilitators would sometimes stop the disagreements. But what I found is that these disagreements can be generative for getting people to reimagine their practice or their visions of equity. So a second case is representative of these instances where instructors will talk about experiencing something in the classroom that they thought was racist or sexist, coming from students or coming from colleagues. In this case, the instructor, who's a Black woman, was talking about how students complained that she talked about race too much. And throughout this telling, she's a statistician. Throughout this telling, some of her peers were responding to issues of sexism, where she was talking about racism. But here we see someone who says, this instructor first says, I feel like I'm failing them. So students' complaints about racism made her feel like she was failing them. And then this person responds saying, it doesn't sound like you're failing them at all. And what this does is, one, it rejects an account of failure on the instructor's part, and it acknowledges the reality of racism. So when someone, generally in my data, when someone makes a complaint about sexism, about racism, about ableism, when someone offers like, oh, this is racism or this is sexist, that's seen as affirming that person's experience and not denying it. But two, as this person continues, they start to talk about this experience being a great opportunity for the students, but also they provide some excuses for the harm that was done. So they start going into, oh, it's because they're young, they're still making sense of the world, which places the blame on youthfulness rather than placing the blame on the systems that promote or allow racism to exist. And these were some common patterns across the data. So I'll talk about a third one that was also quite common. Oftentimes, graduate student instructors would push back on an evidence-based practice. They would find ways to delegitimize the practice. And this is a really good example. This group had just gone through a Think, Pair, Share activity, and they had also watched some sort of phenomenon, some sort of scientific phenomenon to get students to start thinking about how they would apply active learning strategies. And this person, their name is Brad, he posed the question, is there an optimal time for these kind of activities? Which you could hear that as kind of a complaint about how long it took for them to get through the activity. And then Brad goes on, like maybe 5 minutes is too much, or not enough, but 10 minutes is way too much. And in this sort of situation, what was interesting to me is that the decisions around instructional practice were being based on time on task rather than evidence of learning. And that was often a strategy that graduate student instructors would use to push back on whether or not they should use an evidence-based teaching practice. When this did occur, the facilitators would often emphasize the importance of learning goals and needs to inform decision-making, which still would leave open this practical matter of, I only have so much time. Given how little time that I have, how do I use this practice? So the facilitators, like I said, were dealing with both trying to reframe instructional decisions, but also attending to practical needs of instructors. So some general patterns, as I said, disagreements were pervasive. There were so many disagreements and they were never direct. They're often done in really delicate ways, but the facilitators either discourage the disagreements by saying, oh, we can't address this, we have to keep moving forward with our content, or they exploited the disagreements. So they would, for example, if someone was talking about optimal time, as in with the last example, they would start making that into a teachable moment. So I think these disagreements provided lots of unplanned learning opportunities for those in the group. As I mentioned, the facilitators often had to address practical and moral issues, things around what should I do? How should I behave? Should I introduce this equity-oriented practice? And this meant that the instructors couldn't just say, use this evidence-based practice. They also had to have some sort of moral grounding in why. We know that this practice is good because it supports all learners. We know that universal design is good because it doesn't put the onus on students to report their disabilities. It puts the onus on instructors to set things up so that all learners can learn. Another bonus was that the facilitators often use storytelling to illustrate why the practice was effective. Things like talking with students about study, coming to office hours. They would tell a story about a student who they thought was failing, and then that student came to study out or office hours, and it sort of shaped how they made sense of their teaching practice. So facilitators would often use these stories. Another thing, as I mentioned, some facilitators would shut down disagreements, whereas others would exploit those disagreements for learning. And then I also found that the discipline-specific approaches to teaching development were most effective. So for example, the multidisciplinary group, because they weren't all in the same, didn't deal with the same kinds of problems with students, they often had difficulties coming to some sort of understanding or shared understanding about what they should be doing with their practice. But in the discipline-specific groups, they would get into the nitty-gritty of whatever it is about the practice, and they would disagree and debate at really in a greater depth than the other groups were allowed to, or could, I think. So there's very little research on what's happening within teaching development in general, but there's also not a lot of research that compares these discipline-specific approaches and the kinds of issues that arise. So now I want to just briefly return to some applications of this work. I've shown you that there are these particular patterns that take place in teaching development within graduate students. And now I want to show you some of the ways that I'm applying it within this resident education context. So we know, thinking about language use again, we know that language use is impactful for patients and physicians and health teams, sometimes in similar ways, but very different ways. Ultimately, we know that microaggressions, bias, coded language, they all provide threats to psychological and physical safety and security, which is the foundation of social justice. But importantly, for patients, this leads to poor quality of care, which can create health inequities. But also for trainees and physicians and health teams, it can lead to burnout, low professional satisfaction. So it's bad on both sides of the stethoscope, as we say. So in my role, I have the opportunity to work with residents to think about how they're using language during their training and in their practice. And so this is using the data that I've worked with and analyzed, using insights from what people actually do to inform their practice. So one thing that I've had them do is use those transcripts that I showed you on a couple of the slides. I've had them actually role play interactions and say the words that people are saying in those interactions, and then ask them to identify a moment where there might be a microaggression, or there might be some bias, or there might be something that's going wrong in the interaction. And almost every time they can immediately spot, oh, this is what went wrong. Oh, why did they use this word? Well, this is sort of signaling, this is sort of a racialized term. Why would they say this? And there's been some research that's shown that sort of trainings like this, where people are actually role playing the things that people actually say, they can reimagine the things that they say and how to say things differently. Now, this is not to say that I would prescribe to people what to say or that that's something effective, because each interaction, each situation is unique. But the important thing is for people to be able to recognize how they're using language and learn to respond in new ways. And in this study, they found that when physicians did this sort of communication training, it led to more empathy, which is critical for medical practice. They were more able to respond to microaggressions with upstander skills, for example, and they also committed fewer microaggressions. So this is a way that I can apply the findings, for example, from the study that I've done to a practice in a different setting. So some quick implications as I wrap up. Language is part of the system that creates and can disrupt inequities. It's often an under talked about resource for inequities. We know that language is critical for producing racism, sexism, all the isms. And I think that we should spend more time studying how people use language to make these sites of inequity visible and equity visible. And then the third implication, I think, is that we can all learn more about what we do with our words and then decide if we want to do something different. Because I think the reality is that everyone is doing the best that they can with what they have. But if we take the time to examine our words, examine the choices that we make, then I think that we could perhaps produce a different experience for people in our realm, in our friendship networks, in our families, in our communities, in our labs, in our classrooms. Language matters a lot, as I've shown, and I think that this is something that we actually have a choice in changing. All right, I'll stop there and leave it open for questions.
Thanks so much for sharing with us. Can you hear me, Cynthia? Can you hear from?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, so we have time to ask any questions and just about her talk, but then also if you want to wait till later, we can also have a more like informal session and just talk with just like trainees around. So any questions about the talk that you want to raise right now? Yeah.
I have a question. Hi, my name is Andrea. I'm old. I'm from a different time. and I'm teaching students, and my students are getting younger and younger as I'm getting older and older. And so how I relate to them, right, is getting more and more. So things keep coming up, and I have this overwhelming fear of not knowing what to say anymore, or what can be said, and what was progressive in my time is now insulting. And even myself, I'm on the autism spectrum, but I'm learning you can't say spectrum anymore. And so all the terms for everything is changing. And I'm just wondering, do you have any advice for those of us who are kind of, I don't want to say living in fear, but increasingly concerned about that in the past?
Yeah, I really appreciate that you've talked about sort of how generationally things change, how the language that we use in one context was probably acceptable, but no longer acceptable. And I think the advice that I often give people is to read current writings and current blog posts, books, different things like that to stay current with the language. I think that's the work that we all have to do to ensure that we're not walking around unintentionally offending people, but offending them. And also taking the time to, I think reading is what I usually point people to stay on top of what's new and what's current. Another thing that I point people to is there's a lot of work around bringing the experiences and perspectives of those who are most harmed to the center. So for example, in the disability studies movement, the recommendations around language should come from those who are most harmed by ableism. And that, again, it comes with more reading and more being in community with people who are harmed by these isms. And I think it changes fast. So, something that was okay 5 years ago probably wasn't okay. So I think we each have to commit to the work of staying on top of it through reading and taking the time to learn. I wish I had a better answer.
No, that's actually a great answer, and it gives me an idea that if someone were to read, they could definitely do workshops for others who maybe don't have time to do that reading. Great.
Yeah, and podcasts too, if you're a podcaster. There's one that I listen to all the time, Here to Slay by Tressie McMillan Cottom and Roxanne Gay. They often bring in people who I wouldn't have ever thought to look into, but these ways that, like, when we're driving to work or riding to work somehow, this in-between time where we can spend time listening to things so we can hear new ways of talking about the things that we want to talk about and then practice them. And I also think that being in community with colleagues who are of a similar generation and struggling through that learning together can create a safe space for you to be able to practice out something new too, or ask those questions. I have, like, in my generation, we have a group chat. So I'm gonna text my friends and say, hey, I just heard this term. I don't understand what it means. And then we can help each other out. But it's definitely not an individual sort of thing, in my opinion.
As a follow-up to that, or did you have a...
Oh, I do, but it's separate.
Oh, no, go for it.
Hi, Sor. I'm Angeline.
You're Sor?
I am, yeah. So I just I'm a graduate student and I'm working on my teaching philosophy statement. And like I resonate very heavily with like a lot of like social justice issues and wanting to increase like inclusivity and equity in the classroom. But I'm trying to figure out how to balance that because I'm in neuroscience. And so I know like I need to talk about, my teaching philosophy as it relates to neuroscience, but also to these other things. So I'm just wondering if you have any advice on like balancing those two, because I feel like I'm very heavily like on the inclusivity part, but like not really talking about the science as much.
Oh, yeah. So I think you'll probably have to do some work on thinking about your orientation to science itself too, and what neuroscience is to you and how that relates to your teaching practice. Because for some folks, science is just about technique. For some folks, it's, you know, individualistic, it's westernized. And so one of the ways that you can sort of make those bridges is thinking about, like, is my science collaborative? Is it like collectivist? You know, is that how you're approaching science? And how does that relate to then what would you do in your classroom? Because if you see it as an individualistic sort of pursuit, then you'll assign learning activities that are primarily individualistic. Now, granted, some, you know, especially as a graduate student, you might not have a lot of agency around determining what the exams and things are going to be, but you could have other opportunities within the classroom where you might have students do some more collaborative thinking around problem solving, that sort of thing. So I think you could make that bridge between the neuroscience and the teaching by thinking how you're approaching science itself and then putting that together.
Thank you.
One of the things that I think is really neat about discourse analysis that you do is that you can really look in the fine detail of the language rather than just the way that you usually have transcripts and qualitative research. And I was thinking that some of the things that you can pick up that we can't pick up typically in our transcripts is the pauses. And you didn't get to talk about any of the, like, the other symbols that we saw in your transcripts that we usually don't have in our transcripts. So did you notice anything in those, like, non-verbal things where how they said it, not in terms of the word choice, but just the other parts of language, and does that,
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah.
you're able to share any of those trends yet?
Yeah, speech delivery is a huge part of the transcription process. So transcribing not just what people said, but how they said it. And the interesting thing about silence is when people are going to disagree, there's going to be some silence. So if you, in your everyday life, if you notice that you say something and you're anticipating that someone disagrees, if they take a pause or a silence, there might be a disagreement looming. And that was one of the ways that people actually made their disagreements evident. So what usually happen is someone would say something that requires an answer, there would be silence, and then someone would prompt them to say something. It would prompt them to respond. So yeah, there's a ton of silence in the data that I've worked with. All that to say, silence doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing, but in this particular study, it did. Sometimes people use silence to allow space for people to talk so that they can hear what it is that they have to say. And there is a such thing as cutting off silence too early. So I'll give you a concrete example. When physicians are doing their taking history with patients, they'll ask the patient a question and their role is to sit and listen. But if they don't embrace their own silence and they interrupt, the patient won't have an opportunity to share all of the things that they have to say. So it's really all about how people use silence. But in this particular study, it was used to signal a disagreement. They wouldn't say what the disagreement was right away, but eventually there will be a disagreement.
Thank you. Another follow-up question. If there are any other questions. So the other thing is, like, I feel like kind of related to what Andrea mentioned is that sometimes there's this culture of fear of like, oh, I don't want to say something wrong. And then that gives silence. And I wonder if, since you were able to talk about like these different communities where whether you're in the same discipline or separate disciplines, whether that creates an ability to like be more vulnerable, because I also feel like there should be, you need vulnerability in order to have change. But then like, what's the right balance of vulnerability to also reveal some of the things that we've made mistakes on in the past or still currently are making mistakes, and also not like offending people while we're doing that? And also, how do we create like environments of vulnerability?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the ways that we do that here, we think about cultural humility. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but so in order for cultural humility to take place, or people they're being self-reflective and open to other ways of being in the world, you have to be in a space with people who don't have any hierarchy over you, who won't be consequential in getting you fired or something along those lines. But it has to be a group of people who can also hold you accountable and not call you out, but check you on things that you might be saying that are problematic. And that's where that vulnerability, I think, comes into play. And then I think in those spaces, people can work up the courage to practice saying things in new ways in other spaces. So I think it's a similar concept in affinity groups, where people will go looking for other groups of people who are like them so they can vent and talk about their frustrations, and at the same time learn skills for pushing back on the ways that they might be marginalized in different ways. So I think that the vulnerability piece is critical for being able to develop a new language. And it also has to not have these hierarchies or dynamics that could make it difficult for people to share how they really feel. There has to be spaces for people to share how they really feel so that they can develop new ways of thinking about whatever it is that they're doing.
Can I just ask on that, is it possible as an instructor, so I come into a room, I have 60 students, I'm clearly white, blonde, all these things of whatever coming off right away, but is there a way to be an instructor of where there's a hierarchy in terms of I'm the authority on content, but can I create a room of vulnerability in terms of talking openly with my students, that I may, if I do say something to offend you, or if I don't even know how you would go about doing that, but I'm saying have an open dialogue such that they can hold me accountable, maybe not for the content or the signaling cascade I'm teaching, but they can hold me accountable for the way I interact with them. Can you set something like that up, or by being an authority figure, you're just always an authority figure?
I think it's really hard because students are so oriented to that hierarchy. So my general take on this is that those who are in the most power are those who have the most responsibility for doing the work, and also always make the assumption that I'm going to say something that's offensive to somebody instead of if it happens. I know it could happen, I know it will happen. And so I think sort of it's kind of like you want to ask students you want to make a brave space for students. You could say that that's something that you're striving to do, and then the mechanisms by which they hold you accountable couldn't be tied to the student. So you could open it up saying that I want to be sure that this is a safe space for all learners. And I also want to have this mechanism, it could be like anonymous feedback, so that if I say something that's offensive to you, you have a space where you could report that. Then I think what you do with that, it would take a lot of like thinking about what you would do with that feedback. Another way I think it's good to have like a close colleague or a peer to come in and observe sometimes, to be able to give you that kind of feedback. Because I don't think that students feel safe enough. Students often don't feel safe enough to give that kind of feedback if they think it can be traced to them. So for example, if you have a class of like 80 students and there's one Black student in the class, and you get a feedback that says, oh, you said something that was anti-Black, you're gonna know, or at least suspect who it might be. So I think it's important to say that you're striving to create that kind of space and have a mechanism for feedback. But like I said, I think students are so oriented to that hierarchy, it's difficult to get them to hold you accountable.
Yeah.
I have one more question, but I just want to make sure for those of you joining us online, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? Feel free to raise your hand.
I'm good. I'm listening. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually have a question. So I know you talked a lot about like creating an environment in the classroom for students who are neurotypical and those who are not neurotypical. I work in a tutoring center, so I work with a lot of students who are not neurotypical and those who are. What are the best ways that you think to create an open environment for all types of students so that they don't have to like disclose a disability to you like you were talking about?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the universal design for learning principles. So it's more so incorporating that into whatever it is that you're already doing. So if you have a particular tutoring practice, you could incorporate multiple representations of the same thing. Really just, I can't say anything highly enough about the universal design for learning principles. We are currently working on incorporating that into residency education for physicians who have a disability or some sort of neurocognitive disorder. But I think that those principles are pretty easy to implement into any kind of educational practice. Tutoring, I think, would be a really good way to do that. And you could also, during the tutoring sessions, this has been helpful to encourage the people who you're working with to do multiple representations of some problem that they're trying to solve, to help them make sense of, okay, is there a particular representation that works best for me? Because I'm sure it is true where you're at, but here we have a lot of residents who don't find out that they have a disability until they're in the residency program. They often don't find out because people just fall through the cracks, but also because they didn't have folks who were versed in thinking about disability. So thank you for that question. I think those principles can be helpful for guiding how you go about tutoring.
Thank you for your answer as well.
Yeah, let me ask one more question. So let's say we notice a time when there is some microaggression and either from ourselves that we picked up like, oh, I misspoke, or from a student and that we need to address. How do you do it, like just to speak really practically? What are your suggestions on how to like acknowledge that that was not okay? Because sometimes it sounds like half the class might have not noticed it, and then you might be bringing attention to something that might not have needed to be brought to attention. But then at the same time, you kind of feel like, well, no, we should address this. So like, I guess, how do you bring it up in a way that is helpful?
Yeah, so these, I think those like moments of curiosity, taking a curious stance. Am I hearing you say whatever it is? And then sharing what your understanding is of what they've said. So, and this is common for what we call upstander training instead of bystander training, where people will see something wrong and then they'll call and report it to someone else. So upstanders, you take the onus on actually responding to something that someone had said. But starting out with a moment of curiosity, like, I heard you say this. This doesn't align with the value of equity or the culture of equity that we're trying to promote in this classroom, and addressing it. So there's some frameworks around upstander training, and I think that I think it takes some time to learn. So in your friend groups, I think, or peers who can't get you fired from your job, try out some upstander sort of talk, and then I think in those moments, you start to learn more readily how to respond to those. But I think the first move is, did you say this? Or I heard you say this. And if that's what they said, then clarify, oh, this doesn't align with the culture of equity that we're trying to foster in this classroom, so that it's clear to that person, but also instructive to everyone in the room. We don't do microaggressions here.
Thank you. I see that the time is around 12, so I don't know if people need to take off before we have like more time to discuss with Dr. Williamson. Let me go ahead and just see if we could give her another round of applause. Then there is food right outside the door. There's pizza when you exit the door, it's to your right. So feel free to enjoy the pizza and drinks. Just get there, make sure you bring the food outside to enjoy the food. But for those of you who want to stay, we can talk a little bit more with Dr. Williams. She is able to stay with us, I think, for another half hour. So happy to talk more. The other thing is, if you could sign in on the QR code if you haven't already, and that way we just are able to make sure we still have programming like this. So thank you.
I'm gonna put out a meeting that this is a wonderful talk with the students.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We had a student defending today. Graduate defending. Did a little bit of overlap, so a lot of people took off for a little, just right before 12, I think, to go to the defense.
Oh, thanks so much for coming. I'll stand on this side now. It was really great to hear your work. Since when we talked about in the past, it was always just kind of big picture. I didn't really get to see the data. That was really nice to see.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the questions. Is it Andrea?
Yeah, Andrea.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just so interested in, I don't know, as you get older, someday you'll learn, because you're still pretty young, but I mean, you just start to lose touch anyway, regardless of your culture, your background, your ethnicity, and I think that is a pressure for all professors, but I think that coupling that with the current, I guess, pressure to change how you think. Even I talked to fellow professors, and this is probably going to sound totally sexist and whatever, but like I'm spectrum, so I offend people all the time without trying. I talk to my friends who are gay, but they're my age, right? So they're lesbian or they're gay, and even they're confused now because they're well, we used to just be gay and we knew what that was, but now there's all these different genders and you have to be sensitive. It's and it's very confusing, especially when you're teaching bio. And not confusing, but I mean, it's not a confusing thing. It's just, it's an odd situation to be in. It's really tough.
Yeah, I know someone who's done some research on representations of gender and sex in biology textbooks. I think they did a content analysis. At any rate, they were pushing for, with the idea that, language is changing and how we make sense of these things is changing too, that we should always be working to learn the language of the times, and that it's hard work, but it's important work because it honors the dignity and worth of the people who use these different labels.
Yeah.
It's hard though. There's no shortage on learning.
Is there a place that we could go to, if we don't have to read, this is the one that you go to to check, easy check of XP. If I don't have too much time to read, what kind of read real fast to make sure I'm up to date?
It's just, I was just reading online, and I'm afraid to do it, but the okay symbol, it's what you say, okay, that's not okay anymore. it's just like, and it's things like that that scare me, because I'm like, oh my gosh, what if I say like, okay, everybody, and do that, and then everybody thinks like, I belong to some group I don't belong to, or I'm trying to send it. I'm like, I don't know what to do. But anyway, this is my struggle right now with being a person who's always thought of themselves as being very progressive, and now kind of being like, oh,
Yeah, I think that for those of us who, and I've written about this too, for those of us who see ourselves as equity minded, like it's too easy to have that label. And so I think part of the work is not being content with, like at any point, okay, when you get content, that means that the possibility of change is lower. And so at least for me, it compels me to like always be in community with people, because like on your own devices, you can, go way left. But in community with people, there's always going to be someone else who is hearing what you're saying, or hearing how you're thinking, or maybe perhaps has a resource. Like I said, I enjoy reading and listening to books and podcasts and things, because it always pushes my thinking. Like the moment I feel like I've got it figured out is the exact moment that I need to keep going, because I don't. Yeah, so I kind of like from what I'm hearing you say is it makes you uncomfortable with that you might be getting it wrong. And I think I would find comfort in knowing that I'm not there yet. I haven't arrived yet.
Yeah. I guess that I care is the first step.
Right.
Or that it does concern me is the first step. And then if I just said, well, I'm me and I don't care. But
Right.
I have another question for you, because you've been in so many different groups, outreach groups and that, and a lot of them were women-based groups.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that there's a stronger barrier? I mean, I know that there's a stronger. See, I don't even know how to ask the question, but do you feel like the strongest barrier to success in STEM is a gender issue or a race issue? Or do you think, I mean, obviously a combination of both is the most difficult, but in general, where do you feel like the most struggle?
I don't think about them as separate. I guess that's one. I think about all of the kinds of isms: ableism, sexism, racism, transphobia, all of them. I see them as all intertwined. So whenever one is happening, others are also implicated. I think that gender has had a lot of visibility. Race has had a lot of visibility. Disability hasn't been as visible in the STEM education conversations. I think class / socioeconomic status is also not as visible. People will say things like first generation. I'm a first generation college student myself. But people don't talk a lot about how coming from a particular class background sort of provides its own unique barriers to access within STEM. I mean, there's some research out, like in medicine, most people, their parents were a doctor and they're a doctor. I think for PhDs, it's like 50% of people who have PhDs have at least one parent who has a graduate degree. I don't know what studies people are doing around that for STEM specifically. Like if someone's parent has a biology bachelor's degree, are they more likely to have a bachelor's degree in biology? But also like thinking about, like I said, class dynamics. Not 100% sure about that, but I think that, like I said, I think disability isn't as visible in the research. People most often think about gender and race in STEM, but not ability. Sexuality is just starting to come into literature more clearly. I had a colleague who was going to write her dissertation about LGBTQ students in STEM, and this was like 5 years ago. And her advisor told her that that's not an issue in STEM, and it wasn't something to study. There are studies out about it now. All that to say, I think that some issues are less visible than others.
I appreciate what you said about like encouraging us that we do notice that we're like not there yet, but that's actually a good sign.
Yeah, it's the people who, there are like two people that are the most difficult to deal with when doing DEI work. And not because they're difficult human beings, but because there are barriers. People who think that they've got it figured out, like that they know for sure exactly what you should do, are the hardest to convince to do something different. And those who don't care at all, equally challenging. So I like working with people who are in the middle, who are like, I'm not quite sure what I should be doing. Because the other two groups I don't think can be convinced. That's my pessimism.
I like what you're saying about like the hidden, the not hidden, but the less talked about. I mean, even people don't even talk about attractiveness. I mean, if you look at our neurobio department, the professors, the attractiveness scale is like, you know, everyone's like high up on the attractiveness scale.
Mm-hmm.
But people don't talk about like how hard is it to be successful if you don't look successful.
Right.
Physical appearance, you know, and we, there's so much.
Yeah, I always tell people that STEM is a microcosm of everything else that's wrong in society. So if it's wrong everywhere else, it's wrong in STEM too.
Yeah. Well, it was lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I really appreciate the questions and the dialogue.